Okay, we are live. Good evening, everyone. We are live, and as usual, we wait for like 30 seconds to a minute to let people see that we're live and catch on to the fact that we're going to have a dialogue this evening. So we'll give it a few minutes. I'm getting my little notifications that it's actually live on YouTube as well. So it's working. Okay. You never really know if it's going to work, and it's working today. So we're happy about that. Let's see. Good evening. Good evening. I see a couple of people popping in. I want to make sure you know that you're invited to converse with us this evening by messaging. I will get messages, I think, from both YouTube and Facebook. So please, if you have questions, if you have comments, if something just sounds good and you just want to say that was good, please, you're free to do so. And we welcome you in the space. So, good evening, everyone. My name is Dr. Monique Williams, and I am the founder of the Heir+Loom Foundation. And so excited to be here with a new friend, Reverend Dr. Christopher Carter, who we've just kind of met on IG and had exactly one conversation and realized this could be like a really good thing. And so I'm excited for him to introduce himself. But for a reminder, those of you who do follow the Heirloom Foundation, we were just founded about a year and a half ago as I had dialogue with my grandfather, who is still with us, strong, spry, and sharp. And we were talking about what we would do with our family land that he and my grandmother purchased over 50 years ago. I just recently found out he purchased about 20 acres for $450. And now you can imagine how much that is worth, not only to us, but to people around us and corporations around us who are interested in getting to our land. So we want to make sure that we keep this land in our family and meaningful. And on this journey, I've been able to meet some wonderful people that have background in this specific work, as Dr. Carter does, and also just connections to the land through their own family histories and their backgrounds. So that's the Heirloom Foundation. Dr. Carter, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, well, thank you for having me here today. I'm really excited to have this conversation. My name is, I gotta say all the titles. That's
Yes,
like
yes, you do.
all that earned intellectual
Uh-huh,
labor.
uh-huh.
So the full title is Reverend Dr. Christopher Carter. I am an associate professor of theology and religious studies at the University of San Diego. I'm also the assistant department chair and department diversity officer. So that just basically means I have administrative responsibilities, broadly speaking, and specifically with respect to anti-racism and bias training. I'm also the lead pastor of the Loft LA, which is a worship community that's out of Westwood United Methodist Church in Los Angeles. And I've been working there for just over a year. I started full time a few weeks ago and really excited about that position. And yeah, so my research and interests are really centered around food justice, racial justice, issues of land sovereignty, food sovereignty, and how all those intersect, or how I understand these to be theological problems, right? I think for me, it's kind of how I began to be interested in this work. And similarly to you, it was through my grandparents, through my grandfather, and just kind of listening and truly listening and listening to his stories and seeing how they shaped and influenced me. So yeah, it's a pleasure to be here and pleasure to kind of represent him.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I don't know. There's a delay on my side. I don't know if it's on your side, but I think we're going to be okay if we just keep pushing forward. Anyone listening, let us know if there's any issue with you hearing us, even if our videos might be acting up. Let's see. So, Dr. Carter, can you tell us a little bit about that grandfather story, about your background and your connection to nature, your first memories, your happiest, or maybe even your most challenging?
Ooh, man, happiest and most. Well, I would say I'll start with telling the happy stuff. Um, so my grandfather, my maternal grandfather is his name Robert Martin. He was a migrant picker. He always wanted to be a farmer, and I'll share that what happened with that story at the end of this particular beginning. But so he, like many folks, moved up north. He's from Brookhaven, Mississippi. He moved up north to get a job at a factory in Michigan. I grew up mostly in Battle Creek, Michigan. And so that's what he did. Like he worked at an industrial factory, auto plant. as does still the majority of people who live in that state. And that's how he provided for our family and kind of lifted us out of generational poverty. And because he grew up on the land and grew up farming and wanted to be a farmer, he had his, what he called a garden. But I always tell my students, like, I wish I had pictures of it, because it really was like what the hipsters call a homestead today. Like he had like a
Mhm.
big, like we ate from what he grew,
Yeah.
and so that was just normative. And so I just grew up, and honestly, um, I didn't think it was unique, in part because my grandpa lived in the country in tiny Three Rivers, Michigan, and I lived in what I thought was a city, but it was a 50,000 person town. And so for me, my first experiences really were just going to stay with them in the summers. Like we, as soon as, I mean, the day after school, my mama would drop us off.
That was it.
And we see her again until a week before school start. She would come down so we can go school shopping. But that was, oh God, it was so much fun. Like it was so much joy to be able to play outside and be outside all day. We would go fishing. We would go just on like walks, hiking, and just being outside with him, learning, how to garden, which again, I didn't enjoy as a kid.
Yes.
I'm not going to pretend that I did.
Right.
Um, but my grandpa is an introvert, and but he does talk through stories. And so that's really where I began to kind of make some of these connections as I got older.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, it was, that was really how I began to be exposed to his stories and through just his love of being outside.
Yes. Okay. And you said he always wanted to be a farmer and he never considered himself one?
Well, so this is how my family up in Michigan. And this, so the book that I published that came out in December called The Spirit of Soul Food, it's basically a narrative that chronicles food justice through the lenses of religion, looking at specifically my maternal grandfather that I was just talking about, Robert Martin, and my paternal great grandfather was white, from Spain,
Mhm.
and just kind of these different perspectives on power and oppressed and oppressor. So my grandfather had saved up enough money to where he was going to plan on buying some land and becoming a farmer himself. But the person he was working for in New Orleans, or a person he was working for, owned land. He was in Louisiana. That person worked in New Orleans, would be gone during the week, and he would come on the weekends. And when my grandfather told him, "Hey, I'm only going to be with you for another couple of months. I'm working on acquiring, I have contract, I have these things approved to buy this land back in Mississippi." The gentleman said, just argue with them, tell him it wasn't a good idea. And then eventually told him, if you can't quit working for me, because if you do, I'll kill you. And this is, white man, this was my,
Yeah.
legitimate. Like, this wasn't like my grandpa was like, oh, maybe this guy's joking. Like, this was 100% legitimate. And so my grandfather had to essentially flee, so and I would tell him, and I've told him now, like, when he tells these stories, it almost sounds so close to slavery, right? Where my great had to run away, for his life. And so that's how he ended up in Michigan. He snuck away, took the train, was able to take a train to Chicago, made by way Chicago to Michigan, sent for my grandmother a few weeks later, didn't tell her where he was going, but his life was under threat.
Yeah.
And so that was how we ended up there. And that's kind of the story that stayed with him in terms of what he would want to do, but what he didn't think he could do in Michigan. So yeah, that I think also for him has had a sense of, that's why he doesn't want to leave where he's in right now, this rural space, because he loves the land, he loves being outside, he loves nature. And I think that for him to be forced to leave again would kind of bring up the traumatic memories he had of being forced to leave when he was a teenager.
First place. Got it. Okay. Wow. And I know that story is extremely common. If we were all to dig back, those of us who are fortunate enough to have our grandparents still with us, to dig back and ask about their experiences, I can tell you threats. Yes, I heard that in stories. I've heard how difficult it is to either gain the land and then hold on to it.
Yep.
because other people have interest and have money, right? And so, yeah, that's something that we share. And you mentioned already, but I'd love to kind of go back to this trauma connection that we have to land. For those of you all who do not know, Dr. Carter is quite the author and mentioned one of his writings, but he shared a chapter that he wrote, Blood in the Soil. Now, what is the name of the book that came from? Is that the book?
No, that's the name of the chapter in an edited volume. It's the Bloomsbury Handbook on Religion and Ecology.
Okay.
And so that chapter is supposed to be on like essentially race and environmentalism.
Yes. You begin the chapter talking about connecting with young people, young Black people at a garden club, right? And just to read one statement that you said, after explaining to a young Black student what we would be doing, gardening, learning about food justice in California, and cooking, he looked at me and said, "What? Are you trying to make me a slave or something?" Let's talk about that, because I mentioned this a lot in conversation, either on this platform or other conversations, about how um, our experience with the land has been filtered through the enslavement experience. And all we do is see labor and work, and we have run away from it. And so let's talk about that experience right there. How you encountered that young man. What came of that conversation?
Oh man, I wish I had the skills then that I have now to really address it. I think I was surprised that he had such a strong visceral reaction because I had only been in California for a couple of years. And so the people where I grew up didn't, I mean, people were still, there were still some people, who were farm workers, people who had gardens. So I just didn't grow up with Black folks that had this kind of aversion to land from from that particular perspective. And so when he said that, I think I was more just taken aback. And I remember explaining to him, I was like, no, this isn't about making you do something you don't want to do. It's trying to help you understand like how to live and to be able to connect with your past. And I think now, I guess what I should say, so he ended up not joining the club. Like he just was like he just could not get over that hump. Right. of dealing with his own particular kind of internalized trauma, and that's why I described it in the chapter, and that's what that is.
Yes, you mentioned it being embodiment because he himself had not experienced an actual trauma.
Yeah,
this was just from stories and from what we knew, what people told, and what we read in books, right, about our experience. And so here it is. You have generations later of young people who have real, true reaction to working outdoors on the land.
Yeah, and this is there's an amazing book called My Grandmother's Hands by a therapist by the name of Rizma Menachem, and he talks about this concept of traumatic retentions, and that's what this is. It's so his reasoning helps us understand how the trauma of race, in this particular instance, we're talking about forced labor and race. We those get passed on, right? And some of those retentions, even if they have, and we use them as a mechanism of teaching, right, to know what to avoid and how to avoid like encounters with police, or basically encounters that could result in violence to happening to you. But it also doesn't allow for the kind of healing that needs to take place, right? And so one of the things I talk about in chapter 1 of the book, Transatlantic Soul, and Spirit of Soul Food, is really kind of reclaiming the agricultural and culinary wisdom of our ancestors, and recognizing that the narrative we've been told about slavery and about Black people in the land is a lie. Like it is a lie. And so so if you give me just a minute, I'll kind of share just to summarize it. We were enslaved as Black people because of our agricultural and culinary acumen. And so indigenous folks could escape because they could actually, get away. That's one reason they couldn't enslave them. And so it was more efficient to commit genocide. White people could escape and they could blend in. Black people couldn't. But the primary reason that they chose us was because the kinds of crops they could grow in certain parts of the country mirror the crops you can grow in West Africa. And so, for instance, if your people are from North Carolina, genetically, there's a strong likelihood your ancestors can be traced back to the Senegambia region in Africa because they grow the same kind of rice that is grown in the Carolinas. If your lineage can be traced back to Texas, the likelihood is that your ancestry is Fulani because of the kind of animal husbandry techniques that they used. And so there's like 4 or 5 tribes, broadly speaking, you can really trace it back to based on the skill set that we had, right? And so we have to recognize that our relationship with the land and relationship with agriculture starts before slavery.
Yes.
Slavery is a part of the story, but it's not the part of the story. And we had to teach the colonizer how to live. Like
Yes.
literally, they could not have lived without us, not our
Yes.
physical labor, but our intellect, right? Because
Yes.
we're often told that it's our physical labor that we were enslaved. Like, no, that's a part of it. But the broader part is that it is our intellect, our capacity to grow food, our capacity, what I call the agricultural acumen. That's why we were enslaved, and that's empowering. And so this is how can we reclaim this as ours and reclaim
Yes.
the land as ours without just limiting our understanding of the land through slavery. And so that's what I try to do in that chapter. And for me, it was liberating. It was very, very powerful.
That's really good. And you mentioned agricultural acumen, but let's talk about culinary acumen because we have intersections. Everybody, we intersect at Duke, so we have a Duke connection. We have a connection with Methodist Theological School in Ohio and many friends in that space, and we also connect with plant-based lifestyle, veganism. So our stories are different when it comes to what led us there. And my quick summary is that I had a sibling that I loved dearly who was very ill. And at some point, I was told that I might have to give something from my body, right, to him to make sure that he would be well. I was told that I was going to have to give possibly stem cells. Because of that, I'd already played with veganism before. I mean, not veganism, vegetarianism before. I'd always done that. But at that point, I made a choice to go completely plant based, to go clean in preparation for whatever needed to come from me. Right. So that was my story. It wasn't about animals. It wasn't about what I now know, regarding industries, right? Dairy and meat industries, nothing like that. It was for health. But for you, you were led a little differently, and it feeds into what you write now.
Yeah. So for me, I guess there's kind of 2 ways to answer this question, and we can get back to the culinary acumen piece later on. But with respect to moving to veganism, it was the story of my grandfather and the stories. So we would go back to Louisiana or Mississippi and Louisiana every year for family reunions in the summer, which is like absolutely terrible, right? It's like the worst time to go.
Yes.
And he would tell stories when we were driving down, again, because he's introverted and that's the way he talks is through stories. And so we would hear all these stories and I would internalize them, and he would talk about sleeping in shacks and encounters that were racist and snakes and just the backbreaking work he had to do and the ways in which it like was dehumanizing for him. But he's very forward thinking, and I mean, I'm blessed that he's still alive. And he would always say things like he was very grateful. He'd be like, "Oh, this could have been worse." Which in my head, I'm like, I can't. Yeah,
right. That is
I'm
worse.
like, and so then it happened one summer. I was driving from my first time driving from Los Angeles to San Francisco. We took the 5, this corridor that goes along this basically parts of California that's predominantly agricultural. And I could see the laborers working in these fields, and I could see the conditions they had to work in and live in. And I know that if it's this close to the highway, these are the good fields, right? Like these are, because my experience in Louisiana, I'm like, oh, if it's this close to the street, this is the good ones that they're like, oh, but if you actually go in there, it's going to be worse. And I immediately connected their stories to the stories of my grandfather.
Wow.
I connected. I was like, oh, I don't want to be complicit in a kind of suffering that my grandfather endured that these people haven't endured. And so that brought me down this path of looking at not only where I got my food, so not just plant-based, but also looking at where I source my food as best as I can from, but also the ways in which, in particularly meatpacking plants and animal agriculture, the consequences of that disproportionately harm people of color. We're the people who typically work in those plants. We live by them. We deal with the environmental consequences of them. We deal with the suffering from those plants in ways that other people don't. Not to mention the animalization aspects of race. And so all that conspired in me to just say, at the time I became vegetarian, and then I knew, knowing me ethically, morally, that this was the path I was on, was going to take me to a kind of veganism that I call Black veganism. But for me, it's about people. It was about people and being in solidarity with people and recognizing that I didn't want to contribute to the suffering of my people. And if I felt as though I could do something to opt out of systems that were causing and oppressing others, that I should do so. And it required me to learn how to cook. And so that's how I get to the culinary piece.
Yes, there you go. That's a great segue. So it required you to learn how to put meals together that would be enjoyable. Because I think that's the thing people really, and we won't get too far into this, but most people who have any commentary regarding veganism is that it's nasty, as if it's just not a plate of sides. You know what I'm saying? But it does require you to look at food differently, to prepare differently, to look at hunger differently, I think, on my end. And so for you, you had to learn to cook. And so then go ahead, tie that into.
Yeah. So what I had to do was I had to learn. For me, so think about this. I'm in grad school. I'm the first person in my family to go to college, let alone go to graduate school. When I started, I got asked to do a PhD by one of my advisors. I know what a PhD was. He was like, hey, you should consider doing a PhD. I'm like, I don't know, man. My grandpa was a farmer, man. My mama barely graduated high school. I don't know nothing about this.
Right.
And I think recognized that I felt alienated from my family already and alienated from my community because I was so overeducated compared to them. And I struggled with that kind of disconnection that many Black people have when we get that kind of education and people talk about, white performance, And so the idea of becoming a vegetarian or veganism was deeply troubling because I didn't want to fit in that stereotype. And I got dreadlocks, you know what I'm saying? So I'm already moving down this path, according to my family. Live in California, I'm fitting all the stereotypes. And so what I had to do, I had to learn how to cook the foods that I grew up with in ways that were vegetarian and vegan.
That's right.
And that gave me the space to claim a sense of identity and self-worth.
That's right.
And it was a blessing to be able to learn how to do that, to recreate. And this is where I talk about my grandmother. Unfortunately, my grandmother passed away at a young age. She had a stroke. But I remember and she didn't write anything down because she only could use her left hand. And so she lost her ability to really write. And so I had to remember just what stuff tastes like. And I God has blessed me with a good sense of taste, and that improved even after I became plant-based, and that's what I did. I just started recreating recipes. I got a bunch of cookbooks and I started recreating things, and then I'm cooking for other people, and they were like, "Oh, this is really good." I cooked it for my family, and they were like, "This tastes like what grandma used to make," and it gave me the kind of confidence I needed to go down this path of reclaiming an identity that was distinctly Black, that was also vegan, but that was also informed by my Blackness. My commitment to be in solidarity with Black people led me down this path. And so it was an interesting conversation that I was able to have in light of that, because I think we need to take seriously the ways in which we eat and how it impacts broader cultures. We're living with this now with respect to the invasion of Ukraine and the hunger taking place in Africa, right? This stuff is deeply connected. And so, which is why we do what we do, right? You and I, we understand those connections. And I think we have to get past the idea of health and wellness, or even vegetarian or veganism, as something that's steeped in whiteness, because that's colonialism. That's a colonial logic for us to be naive to think that people in Africa prior to colonization didn't have a predominantly plant-based diet.
Correct.
Right. And so we have to work through that trauma again. to realize that our understandings of health and wellness can't be filtered through the white colonial gaze anymore.
Yes. So going back to, and at least staying on the topic of this acumen that we had, and which is why, a reason for the enslavement of the Black body, that you mentioned is a very empowering way to look at this not so empowering past, right? The fact that our enslavement was because of a strength of ours, and it wasn't just brute physical strength. right? Which is what is generally told to us in writing and in stories, because our bodies were animalized, our entire person, right? Um, and so, like that's quite a turn, I think, for a lot of people to kind of look at. Like it was because we were good at planting, and it was because we were good at land, because we were good at food. Um, when you teach this concept, how do people receive this? How do you get to an audience of people and teach this concept? Have you seen people really embrace and understand, what you're trying to help? I guess anybody who would listen understand about what enslavement did to us, and how it has impacted the way that we see ourselves, we see food, we see land, right? Um, just talk to us about that.
Yeah, it's kind of, I guess, three different responses. One is people who are older, people like my grandfather and your grandfather. Um, the first time I started talking about this, my grandpa doesn't really cry, and he like got misty eyed, which for him is
Mm-hmm.
basically crying.
Mm-hmm.
Um, because I think for them, this is an intuitive knowledge that it's something intuitive they know,
Yes.
right? Like they deep, like what Howard Thurman calls the sound of the genuine, like that thing
Mhm,
in us that is true. Like
mhm,
they know. They're like,
mhm.
oh yes, this is that love that I've had to this land, this ability to provide,
Yeah.
right? This is in me, and it's a good thing,
Mhm.
and it was taken advantage of. But that doesn't mean I am not worthy, that I don't have dignity, right?
Yes.
It speaks to the people who did the taking advantage of, not to me. It's not a
Mhm,
character flaw within me. And
mhm.
so it creates a space for healing that I think, people who are still, they were so close to slavery, right? Like that's not that many generations ago.
Yes.
They carry a deeper kind of trauma. And so when I teach that to them, it resonates, I think, in a profound way, and they can
Mhm,
connect back to their stories of their youth and what they could do.
mhm,
When I teach it to like kind of people my age,
mhm,
I'm in my 40s,
mhm,
their response is definitely going to be much more, typically critical,
mhm,
because they're going to hear it and think more about it from like this kind of white performativity. It's
mhm,
and I'll say, look, this is actually, this is the truth with
mhm.
respect to, I have archives that show how, and this is, I apologize for anyone who this is just sad, I guess, about, there's no other way to say it,
Okay.
but like, um enslavers literally had like lists, and they and spaces and places to go to say, okay, if you grow this crop, you want to buy black people, obviously they didn't say that word,
Mhm,
from these ports, and they usually sell them around these times a year. So they were
mhm,
very, very specific about the
mhm.
kinds and where they were buying black
Yeah.
bodies for labor to
Yes.
grow this kinds of food. It was very precise, right?
Yes.
And so I'm like, no, this is
Mhm.
about, it's our knowledge. And
Right.
so some of this, I think, is a rethinking of, you know what success means, what it means to be whole, what it
Mhm,
means to move outside again of those dominant structural norms of whiteness and
mhm, mhm.
colonialization, to allow that to take root rather than to view themselves through this kind of success only looks like this upper middle class vision.
Yes.
Um, the young people tend to understand it more, I think, because they've grown up in an era, and by young people I mean people in their like early 20s.
Yes.
These folk, they've grown up in an era of climate catastrophe.
Mhm,
Like they know the planet is like, they know we're killing the planet, and
mhm.
so they are invested in trying to figure out ways for them to survive and flourish.
Right.
And I think we make a mistake of assuming that like even like poor black youth or poor youth aren't interested in this. Like they are. It's
Mhm.
about capacities and time, but they're
Right.
interested in their own particular ways because they want to live.
Yes.
And so I those are kind of three broad responses I get. I do
Mhm.
really well with older people and younger
Mhm.
people. It's people my own age that I'm like,
No,
that
but
take a
listen.
little bit more work, but we're invested in the system,
Yeah.
like they a little more successfully invested in the system. I think the benefit of growing up poor for me is like, I see the system for what it is. And I'm not gonna be fooled by just a little bit of money that the man decides to give me, so I
Yeah.
can be okay right now.
Yeah. 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 So I'm only thinking of three intersections, but you can name some, or three things that intersect, but you can name others. Your work, theology, blackness, environmentalism. Is there something else that you would add?
No, I think those are, I mean, gender is in there in a sense when I talk about, and you can't escape gender when we're talking about food because of the ways in which women have been, well, two ways. One, for those of you who don't know, women are the primary like farmers and agricultural workers globally. And so we think about, if you just want to look at, so if we say we're going to talk about just Black folks, right? Talk about the
Yes.
continent of Africa. The majority of farmers on the continent are women. They get only 1/3 of the farming subsidies, right? And they're usually responsible for feeding their families and growing their own food. And
Yes.
so, like, this is a woman's issue first and foremost, you
Mm.
know, when we're talking about issues of food. And I try to make that clear. Most of the resources I use are women for that
Mm-hmm.
specific reason. And then secondly, because women have historically been confined to the kitchen. You
Yeah.
know, this idea of cooking is seen as a chore rather
Right.
than a way to tell a story, right?
Right.
Rather than a way to actually connect us to our ancestors. And so you have to tend to those ways in which gender is at play, because it always is with respect to agriculture and food.
Yeah, and I appreciate you saying that. Well, doing the work, because I noticed that you like womanism and all of all of that work. I think that we can talk about, but if you go too young or too old, that concept of womanism, like what is that? But it makes me think about all that was done from the kitchen. So it wasn't just food, right? It was healing. You're talking about now. You're talking about like midwives
Yep.
and healers, and how they took things that were edible in order to help us to find, a wholeness and a whole, a well space, in our bodies. And so, just like, and we're going to transition into the church in a moment. But just like in the church, how the female voice is often, or the female light is often dimmed, but we are at the core of the movement of faith, right? Same with food. I am. How do you feel as a male in this space, right? Do you feel like you do refer to a lot of women, like you mentioned, you said that a lot of my resources are women, but for you, do you feel like people have heard you differently because you are a Black male speaking about the silencing of Black female voice in these areas?
Yes. I mean, I think I have, you know, um, a tremendous privilege in being a man writing about this. You know, and literally every source in my book that it's all Black women or Latinx women. Like
Yeah.
in terms of and this section's about food, culture, identity.
Mhm.
Um, and and again, like I said, that was very intentional because I felt like there was their intersectional approach to understanding these topics it's just better than men.
Yeah.
So I think on one hand, the challenge for me has been recognizing that I resonate much more because I was mostly raised by my mother and my grandfather, again, as I said, introverted. My grandmother, while had a stroke, couldn't speak well, but was much more present in my life.
Mhm.
There's a way in which I have always gravitated towards women in terms
Mhm.
of my own, even what I would say, even my parenting is probably much more maternal than
Mhm.
one might actually suspect.
Mhm.
Um, and so on one hand, personally, that's been somewhat challenging to be in that space, knowing that there's only so far I can go. But at the
Yes.
same time, what I try to do in doing that is really lift up and give voice to
Yes.
some great thinkers, some great writers and activists, in a way that which maybe perhaps they otherwise wouldn't be heard by men, because
Mhm.
women may be familiar with them, but not by men.
Yeah.
And so there is, and also being a clergy person, to be fair, also gives me a certain sense of privilege within Black cultures, especially, because I can translate some of the radical stuff I'm saying in
Yes.
a way that doesn't sound that's just as radical,
Mhm.
but it sounds more palatable. And
Mhm.
so that's kind of been a blessing too.
In your research, what have you something that you found out that was just very intriguing about women in this space, right? So you've used, their you refer to them a lot of your references, a lot of your examples and stories. But is there anything that you could share that's just been like completely enlightening or amazing about women in the land or farm space or theologically?
I would say what the story that's most impressive to me, and this is Fannie Lou Hamer and her
Mhm.
work with the Freedom Farm Cooperative.
Mhm.
I think it wasn't surprising because, like, I grew up around Black women,
Yeah.
so I wasn't like surprised. I
Yeah.
was like, oh yeah, Black women was like, hey, people need to eat. We gotta grow some
Yes.
food, like that made sense, And again, it was deeply political, right? For those
Yes.
of you who don't know, like she starts this farm in response to voting activism in Mississippi.
Mm.
What happened was, um it it actually became out of fashion to lynch Black people in the late
Mm.
60s. It became out,
Out of
and
fashion.
so it came out
Mhm,
of fashion. Like, so to
mhm,
punish Black folks, that if
mhm,
you vote, they're saying, well, we're just gonna take away jobs and we'll starve you. Like, literally, they were
mhm,
like, well, you're just gonna kick you off our land and you're gonna starve you. And so that was a way of reprisal. So what she did was petition folks to raise money to buy land,
mhm.
and to have a bunch of, basically do small sharecropping and tenant farming on their own land. And it was just so, and she could see the way in which food sovereignty was going to give them a particular kind of political sovereignty that they
Yeah.
otherwise wouldn't have. Like, so forward thinking,
Mm,
that, and also, even though she predominantly supported Black people and Black culture, she allowed white folks, because poor white folks were marginalized from this practice too. Like,
right.
like they were farmers getting kicked off land, because in order for these farmers who owned the land to get government subsidies, they couldn't let anybody do any work,
Hmm.
because that had the faux appearance of neutrality. And so she was able to even like work through all those kinds of obstacles and challenges to just do something amazing. And
Yeah.
so that's chronicled in the book Freedom Farmers
Okay.
by Monica White.
Yes, yes,
And Monica's good people. And
yes.
so it's just an amazing story. And again, so it's funny, like surprising. I was like, I don't know that I read anything that surprised me, but
Right.
it was just impressive, because when I first thought of Fannie Lou Hamer, it's only the politics. I
Yes.
didn't know about the food
Mhm,
activism until, just maybe 6 or 7 years ago.
mhm.
And it's just really deeply impressive.
That's good. That's good. So, environmentalism, blackness, gender, now theology. What does God have to do with this?
Well, for Black folks, a whole lot. I would say
A whole lot.
most of us grew up religious, and
Uh-huh.
so the ways in which we interpret our faith really does influence how we relate and connect to the land. And sometimes, it's either whether it be misinterpretations of the creation narratives and this idea of dominion and subdue,
Mhm.
or whether it be using the second creation narrative, which is much more relational, agricultural, to inspire. Those narratives really do continue to shape the ways in which we relate to ourselves and to others.
Mhm.
And so, what I have tried to do in thinking about this theologically is do it from both a foundational standpoint, to say, okay, how do we understand our relationship to creation as people who are created by God,
Mhm.
but also what are our moral obligations to those who are impacted by our ecological decisions,
Okay.
right?
Mm.
And so that's kind of where I have this do this dance in the book,
Yes.
right? Of what's our foundation with respect to how we should connect to the land theologically, but then also what ought we do in
Mm.
light of the impact we have in ways in which our actions can impact others.
Yeah. And what ought we do?
And so
Who's
when I talk
doing the
about,
work right now? If you could name people, organizations, or books, any one or two that are doing the work, that are trying to answer some question, any of the questions that we probably brought up in this conversation, who are they?
well, one that isn't religious that I
Mhm.
absolutely love is Soul Fire Farms and the work they're doing up in
Yes,
upstate New
with
York.
Leah Penniman.
Leah Penniman,
Penniman.
um, just doing fantastic work. I would highly recommend reading that book if you haven't, especially if you're interested in actually starting to grow food or just learning
Mhm.
about it. It's the same kind of project of reclaiming Black intellectual integrity
Mhm.
and agricultural integrity, and ingenuity. And the work she's doing up in upstate New York is amazing. Which gets to the doing part, which is, even if you can't grow food, which some of us don't have the space or capacities, trying to figure out ways to purchase your food from direct farmers, whether it be CSAs or going to a
Mhm.
co-op if you can, um, like joining a co-op, like that is
Mhm.
such a powerful way to subvert this structural evil of our food system.
Mhm.
And so she talks, I mean, basically, So Far Farm is a giant co-op.
Mhm.
And so that's one I would highly, highly, highly recommend purchasing that. The other organization I know you're familiar with is Heber Brown's Black Church Food
Yes,
Security
Black Church
Network.
Security Network. Yeah.
And for me, I think what he does theologically, it helps people understand that how might we, as if you're religious, right? If you're a church, how can you be a hub, a conduit to help
Mhm.
feed people, right? In these
Mhm.
food insecure areas, like these spaces that suffer from food apartheid, like, the kind of systemic structural barriers put in place that denies access to healthy food,
Mhm.
right? How can we subvert those? And what
Yeah.
he's able to do is allow to connect with farmers to sell direct to consumer, that allows people to actually have access to just extremely healthy food. And this really supports farmers. Like, I
Mhm.
think I cannot undervalue or understate how
Yes.
crucial that is, because they're actually getting a fair wage rather than the kind of wage they're getting from these corporations that buy their food.
Mm.
And so those are a couple of organizations. Leah Penniman has a book that I would highly recommend, that talks about her work. I think it's called Farming While Black, if I'm not
Yes.
mistaken.
Yep.
Yep.
It's I have it right
You
here.
got it right.
Uh-huh.
And so that book is great. I mean, I think, I'll be honest with you, I feel like my book is actually pretty good. It talks about this
Okay.
stuff at the very end, so I'm
Sure,
not gonna,
please.
I mean, to be fair, I mean, it's kind of good reviews. It's done well.
Yes. Good. Now,
So
did Dr. Brown, didn't he write in your book? Did he write a segment or anything in your book?
he didn't write it, but he wrote a little blurb, like,
Blurb.
talking
Okay.
about the book.
Okay.
But he's
Got it.
in the book. I
Okay.
talk about him in the book, like, so
Mhm.
he's in the
Okay.
book.
Okay.
So my relationship with him has definitely shaped some of my thinking in terms of how people can be active in this space, because a lot of folks um, don't know what to do. And so I
Yeah.
wanted to make sure the end of the book is really tangible actions. Like, this
Yes.
is where you can get engaged on every level. And I try to give something for all people because, again, I grew up poor,
Mhm.
and I couldn't do the activism I do now. And my
Yeah.
mom couldn't have done the activism, but there are other things she could have done,
Yes.
and that people can do regardless of where they kind of fall on the economic spectrum.
Yes. And let's go over those again because I think you're right. I think it's kind of intimidating to a lot of people when we talk about things you're supposed, what we need to do, right? That moral obligation. Because I mean, I think the loudest voice in this dialogue would be like a vegan voice, but that's very intimidating. I have found in spaces, black or not, that it can be a very judgmental space and a very hard space, right? Because not everybody thinks in this way, right? But you mentioned purchasing and supporting locally being a huge way to support farmers, right? And what else? So if you want to go plant-based, or we encourage a plant-based, try to incorporate that in your lives however you can. But then beyond that, what can the person who just is like, I don't even know how to start. We're talking about how people are treated, in Guatemala, while I'm here in Texas. Like, this is just too much for me to grasp. What am I supposed to do?
I would say the easiest thing for you to do, there's two easy things. One is to look at what you're eating.
Hmm.
And by that, I mean, I can tell you, if you are eating animal products, you are harming people of color. Like, there really
Hmm.
just isn't a way
Hmm.
around it.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
so trying to reduce, and I talk about this, and part of the reason I use the term black veganism as opposed to like
Yes.
regular veganism or white veganism,
Hmm.
is because this is a veganism, again, that's centered on people, right? It's centered on the intersectional justice issues that impact people of color who are disproportionately harmed by these facilities. And I want to always center that black experience as to why we need to shift and change
Hmm.
how we acquire this food. And so reducing the amount of animal products you eat, right? Thinking and being critical about like how you're preparing your meals, and by that I mean where you're purchasing your food. So if you can subscribe to a CSA, that would be great.
Hmm.
And if you can't subscribe to a CSA and you can't like be active with respect to maybe your diet and things of that nature, my hope would be that you could actually have these kinds of conversations in community with others, and
Hmm.
so that we can actually do more community care. Like, I'll be honest, like, again, as I've said a few times, growing up poor, like, it was the community of us being able to, my mom working multiple jobs, having friends and neighbors where people
Yes.
would cook and we would just all eat together. Like,
Yeah.
none of this was done alone. And
Hmm.
sometimes we think we have to do this alone.
Yes.
And I'm like, no, like, talk to people. It's like, I've
Hmm.
been learning about this. This is really important to
Hmm.
me. It's pressing on my heart, but I don't know that I have the capacity to do something. How do
Yes.
you feel about this? Maybe we can do something together to ease both of our collective burdens,
Hmm.
so it doesn't feel so difficult, right?
Hmm.
We can't do this as individuals,
Hmm.
right? Like, this individualistic way of being in the world is really, I would argue, antithetical
Hmm.
to the black tradition, but definitely the black religious tradition.
Yeah.
And so, so trying to cultivate that kind of space. And the last thing I would say is, for those of us who are affiliated with religious organizations, or organizations that have land that's not being used, we need to figure out how we can utilize, especially if it's black owned, we need to figure out how we can use that land to support our community. That may mean having a garden or a small farm. That may mean actually just growing cash crops, which you see
Mhm.
happening at churches in the Carolinas, especially, right?
Mhm.
Like it doesn't, but what that does, I'm just not a fan of just watering grass just for the sake of having grass.
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
I'm like,
I don't want to put you on the spot, but we had a dialogue, a friend of mine with the history of the pristine lawn, right? And I don't know if you have, because you've done actually more research just in that arena, if you have any insight, if you want to share with people about where this lawn concept came from and how we shifted from using land, like utilizing land to produce and to eat and to live, to just having these pretty spaces that produce nothing.
the quick answer is racism.
Mhm.
So
Right.
that's the quick answer.
That's a quick answer. Uh-huh.
Like,
But
racism.
like people would say, like I'm telling you, I can name probably about two folks on this conversation who are like, "Yep, that makes sense to me." But for most people, they're
Yeah,
like,
yeah,
"Lawns, racism, y'all are
yeah.
really getting some." Like, what do
And,
y'all?
and so we're talking about suburbanization, this
Mhm,
idea of people being able to leave the city, move to the suburbs. This was the beginning of white flight, right?
mhm,
As integration becomes more legally required, even though red lining laws still were in place, people move to the suburbs and they want to have these nice lawns. They want to have their own space. They want to have a white picket fence, that kind of American dream. This American dream is filtered through the lens of particularly of French and English visions, right? Of the what do they call those? The name just escaped me. Chateaus. And how you
mhm,
have these chateaus over there where you have the landed gentry who have these huge, immaculate, sculpted gardens,
mhm,
right? And lawns. And
mhm.
so if you were to look at like the Palace of Versailles or any of these other chateaus, again, all these other places, you see a deeply and profoundly manicured space. And it's a sign of wealth, it's a sign of power, and a sign of control,
Yeah.
honestly, over nature. Like I can exert a particular kind of control
Mm,
over the land
that's
in this
it.
particular kind of way.
Mhm,
And so that's what these people are trying to do, right? So they're escaping Black people. They're trying to establish themselves as having a certain kind of control over the land, and exerting a certain amount of power over it, and they're trying to connect themselves to this long history of white wealth,
yeah.
and so all of that's at play. And so then we as Black people, right, when we move out to the space, we want to prove our humanness, right, in a
Mhm,
sense by doing the same thing they're doing. And part of the argument in my book is that is a faulty pursuit,
mhm,
right? We
mhm.
can't prove our humanness by being or acting or performing human through the lens of what white people have defined it as, right?
Yes.
And,
Yes.
and and that just essentially means we have to define what it means to be human in ways that are about solidarity, about love,
Mhm,
and about interconnection.
mhm.
Because within the white structure of human, what it means to be human is very much about an oppressive hierarchy that's
Yes.
rooted in patriarchy, racism, sexism, ableism,
Yeah.
all those other things. And so that way of being human is inconsistent, incompatible with the kind of, I would hope, love and justice orientation we all want to have.
Yeah.
And so what I argue for really is just kind of dismantling that narrative, right?
Mhm,
Decolonizing is the word I use.
mhm,
And that takes some healing. So I talk a
mhm.
lot about compassion in the book, a lot about compassion, because this is not easy.
Self-compassion, compassion for others, and in what way do you say we need to be compassionate?
Oh, I argue that the work that you and I are doing, I call
Mhm,
it it's a compassionate act. I talk about taking
mhm.
compassionate actions. So I
Yeah.
start the book with like self-compassion in terms
Mhm.
of dealing. I think the first sentences in the book I said like I didn't want to write this book because I didn't want to because it was going to require me to be like not this version of the book
Yes.
because I'm really vulnerable. I talk about like people don't talk about poverty really in the academy. They
Mhm.
don't talk about the fact that one side of my family is like literally like oppressing the other side of my family,
Yeah.
and that's tough.
Yeah.
But for me, compassion is what helped. What I wish that I had that language to talk to that young kid who
Mhm.
said, "Right, are you trying to make me a slave?"
Yeah.
Right, and it's that I needed to do my own internal healing,
Mhm.
right, in terms of dealing with my own traumas of land and race and the connectivity to non-human nature.
Yeah.
And then I also, in so doing, need to allow me to extend compassion to those who are in the fields,
Mhm.
those who are in the factories, those who are doing that kind of work, to humanize them, not to see
Mhm.
them as like just tools and pawns so I can eat, but to see
Mhm.
them as full human beings, and then to create a compassionate response,
Yeah.
right? So I argue that Christianity at its best is a spiritual path of radical compassion. And so
Yes.
that's why I'm trying to teach people how to kind of live that out. And so compassion is in the beginning, it's in every chapter, it's woven through it. I think it's the only thing that makes it sustainable. This work is through the lens of compassion.
That's beautiful. The story about the young man that you had encountered just continues to kind of echo in my mind, because I think about the few times I've had a chance to plant with young people, and you realize how the adult voice, the adult, whether it's a mother voice or father voice or whatever it is, becomes that child's inner thought, inner voice, right? And they listen to how you respond to things around you, and they imitate those things. And so I remember having a chance to plant with some young men who are in foster care and in a group home setting. And we had built a raised garden, and we filled it up and we were ready to plant. And there was one young Black child, I want to say maybe 3 Hispanic young men, and then 1 Caucasian. And just the way that they encounter the earth and the land. The Hispanic gentlemen were a bit more like full of pride, right? Like, oh, I know what that is. I've done that. And the young white man just really wasn't engaged at all. It just wasn't anything that drew him. And the young Black man he was quieter. But when I say he was the most knowledgeable of that group, the way that he touched the earth, and my parents are probably listening right now because they were with me. They're my volunteers. Okay. So my parents are my 2 volunteers, and they were with me, and we watched how he handled things and how he came up with things systematically. So if they were watering something, he would say, well, let's get bottles and we'll put a little hole in it and do it like this instead of just kind of. And I just loved watching him, but I also could tell that he was comfortable doing this kind of work. It was hot outside. No, it was cold at that time. It was actually cold outside. It wasn't comfortable, but he was doing that alongside people who looked like him. And we were saying it was okay. And we were saying that we enjoyed it, and he enjoyed it just as much. So I think about how, like, us doing that helped to inform and give him joy that he could carry with him, instead of saying, oh yeah, I don't know why we're doing this. I don't know, the things that we say out loud, our self-talk that we say out loud becomes like this, the foundation of their language to themselves. So that story with the young man is just, I love it because I think it is important. And it's basically where we always have to start when it comes to shifting and changing the paradigm with our children, with our youth. So that was just a thought. So this is a big question that really ultimately may or may not be able to be answered. But so what do we do? Okay, we've talked about most of the challenges that come with the land and Blackness, and why we are where we are with our understanding and our we don't have an affinity like we used to. What do we do? You're in the academy, so a lot that you talk about is likely theoretical, but let's say we walk into a room together with young people, and we need to impact them. We only have half an hour to make them feel like what we're talking about really is something that they should carry on. What are we saying to them?
So that's such a great. So if I could do that a half hour and I had my ideal setup, I would have cooked. So I'd have some food.
Yes.
And I would have stories and pictures.
Okay.
I think we have to tell a story that allows people to find their place in that story. And so I'm going to tell the story of how it's like almost similar to what happened in the 1619 Project, right? In the children's book. I don't know if you've read that.
Yes,
Born on the Water.
I have it right over there.
It is. I read it to my son, and it's our origin story, but framing it through the lens of land, and helping them to realize that agricultural acumen that I talked about, that's a part of who we are. That's a beautiful part of who we are. Yeah. It's a brilliant part of who we are, and that's how our kingdoms of Africa got to be so wealthy, because we were so good at this. And then the trauma we've endured, but the ways in which we are going to heal. And the reason I'm going to have food is I'm going to talk about food as a healing mechanism, that food as a way in which we carried over some of our skills and we're able to maintain a connection to our African or West African roots, even in America. And then I'm also going to have pictures and tie it into my own story, personalize it,
Mm-hmm.
so they understand that this is meaningful for me. This isn't something that's abstract.
Yes.
I think I always call myself like a practical theologian because my work, it's theoretical in a sense, but like everything that I wrote is things that I've either done or had people do or work with people doing because the ideas for this book germinated when I was a pastor at a church in Compton, California. And so we were doing this stuff. So my church became mostly plant-based because I was mostly plant-based as the
Mm-hmm.
pastor.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what they were like, well, that's what we're gonna do. It's what the pastor's doing. And so we
Mm.
talked about this.
Yeah.
It's the last thing I'll say because I know we need to wrap up. But
You're
like
fine. Yeah.
I will say the thing that, and so that's what I would do in a half hour.
Mm-hmm.
And in
Mm-hmm.
so doing, we might learn and discover things we didn't know about people. So for
Yeah.
instance, when I talked to the Black women at my church, so many of them didn't eat that much meat if they ate any meat at all, but they wouldn't
Mm-hmm.
identify as vegetarian because
Mm-hmm.
they associated that with whiteness and white culture.
Yes.
Right. And these are older Black women that were talking about their health and their wellness, and they were already connecting it to their morality and
Mm-hmm.
religion. But again, the weight of whiteness is
Mm.
heavy,
Mm-hmm.
right? It is heavy.
It's heavy.
And so one of the things we always have to do is not only practice this in a sense of compassion, but and not be judgmental, because as you
Mm-hmm.
said, that can be a way in which we can come across,
Mm-hmm.
but be open and accepting and try to understand where people are coming from, right?
Yes.
Have a trauma-informed response rather than a judgmental response,
Mm-hmm.
and really extend them the kind of compassionate care you would hope somebody would extend you.
Yes.
And that I think is a process we can go through of healing. And that this is, I think, as much as it's an external
Yeah.
project, we need to go through some internal healing as well as Black folks
Absolutely.
because of the legacies and those traumatic retentions of enslavement or forced agricultural labor.
Absolutely, absolutely. So before we end, so I always end with something called a rapid, what do I call it? Rapid fire affirmation. So have you heard at rapid fire with oh gosh, all kind of people have done it I think before, but so we do an affirmation together. But before we end that way, I love to end that way, just share again maybe your social media, your books, so people can be aware, know where to find you, because I think that we may have intrigued several people in this dialogue.
Well, my the probably best way to connect with all my stuff is on my website, which is www.drchristophercarter.com. It has links to my social media. It has links to my books and different articles I've written. Probably the one that's gotten the most press is when I went for LA Times a couple of months ago. That one got picked up by a few other papers. Wrote Things for the Root, which is also pretty good. And this chapter we were talking about is available on there for free because I'm all about public access to knowledge. And so that's where you're going to find a lot of my work.
Okay.
And so, yeah, if anybody has any questions, I'm easy to find,
Okay.
so if you got questions, you want to talk about stuff or learn about things, definitely send me an email. I'll be honest, I'm going on vacation next week.
Okay.
So
Good.
this is the last work I'm doing, and then
There you go.
we heading out. So if you get me this
Congrats.
week, you might not get back to you till next week,
Right.
but I'm gonna get back to you because I have earned this vacation after
Yes.
7 years and just getting tenure. We are gonna celebrate
Wow.
some time
Yes.
together. So
Congrats, congrats, congrats. So, okay, so let's just end with this. This is very simple. I'm going to read a statement, and then I just want you to complete the sentence with one word or a short phrase that comes to mind. Very
okay,
simple. So, the statement is, it is in my nature to, so then the whole thing is in my nature to see blank. It is in my nature to see.
man, it's in my nature to see suffering,
Hmm. It is in my nature to feel
compassion,
compassion. It is in my nature to attract.
mm, love,
Hmm. It is in my nature to reject.
oppression,
Mhm. It is in my nature to embrace.
nature,
Nature.
like everything.
Yeah, that's two. It
That's
is in my nature to love.
it's in my nature to love everything.
Yeah. And finally, it is in my nature to be.
A healer.
Yes. Well, Dr. Chris, we thank you for this evening. Thank you for spending some time and just bringing your scholarly I don't contribution to this larger conversation. The fact that we're having this dialogue and then it's getting easier and easier to find people that look like us that have these conversations and that are deeply passionate. And so I pray that with God you can co-create this space in your world where you can see and respond to suffering, that you can feel compassion, that you attract love, reject oppression, that you can embrace nature, love everything, and be the healer that God has called you to be.
Amen.
Amen. Thank you so much. Have a great evening, everyone. This was absolutely amazing. Please make sure you all check out his website and support in every way possible. And if you don't know how to support, if you don't know what to do, find our names online, look on IG, and we'll brainstorm ways for our community to grow stronger in our connectedness to God, to nature, and to one another. Good night, everyone.